Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. A few weeks ago, when I reached out to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges to ask him to speak with us, I thought we'd be talking about the status of Ukraine's counteroffensive. But in light of the developments over the weekend and the short-lived mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin's mercenaries, the Wagner Group, I think that's where we need to start. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges served as Commanding General of United States Army Europe from 2014 to 2017 before retiring from the Army in early 2018. He's currently based in Frankfurt, Germany, and serves as Senior Advisor to Human Rights First, among other engagements, and he's frequently seen in the German and US media. Ben, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Steve, thank you. I love the audience that you attract, and frankly, your style also. I always enjoyed the format, so I'm grateful for this.
Well, thank you again. And I know that we have a lot to talk about, but I really think that the starting point for our conversation has to be what happened over the weekend, namely the attempted mutiny by the Wagner Group. And I want to maybe start by asking you two questions. The first question is, were you surprised to see Wagner Group tanks rolling toward Moscow? Did you think that something like this could happen? And then the second question is, what do you make of the very quick resolution of this matter?
So I would like to tell you that I knew exactly what was going to happen, that I called this a long time ago, but of course that would be false. I was surprised that it happened like it did. Now, it has been known for a long time that Prigozhin hated Shoigu. This guy, he's a businessman and a showman. He's not a professional soldier. And so he acted like a businessman and a showman. The tensions had always been there. And we know that the Russian army traditionally hates mercenaries. They hate Chechens and they hate the FSB intelligence service. So these kind of conditions existed in the corruption that has been really come to light over the last, let's say, a couple of years, that permeates the entire defense ministry. It's breathtaking. So it shouldn't be a surprise that something like this happened, but I was surprised with how easily it kicked off. The fact that I think it really came to the surface. You remember, everybody will remember when Prigozhin showed this horrible video of all his dead men behind him, and he's yelling into the camera, telling Shoigu and Gerasimov it's their fault while they're sending their kids off to schools in the West. He's out there and his men are being killed. And that was the fact that he didn't get killed himself immediately after that or whatever was an interesting revelation to me, that he would be allowed to live. So all of us were thinking, okay, well, obviously he's got some kind of protection, presumably from his old friend Vladimir Putin, or maybe he's got something on Putin, and that's why he's able to kind of push the limits. Mm-hmm. But he always stopped short of flat out talking about Putin the way he did other people. And so it would not be the first time that a Russian leader kind of encouraged or tolerated rivalry amongst his subordinates. You remember, or you won't remember, but you'll know Stalin, of course, famously would bark at Zhukov and who was the other one? Konev, I think, the two commanders that were racing for Berlin in 1945. And he would tell one, "Why are you going so slow? The other guy's almost there." And then he would tell the other guy, "What's your problem? Zhukov is almost already there." So that is an old tactic. To your second question.
But wait a minute, before we get to the second question, and perhaps I should have waited with the second question. There's a lot of tension between Prigozhin and Shoigu, and that's nothing new, right? That's been there before. There's been this sort of back and forth between the two, really kind of a sparring between the two. that has had an impact on the battlefield as well. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear your assessment of that as well.
One of the most important characteristics of a successful military operation is unity of command, unity of purpose. Everybody's focused, on whoever the main effort is, on the priority, and everybody else is expected to ensure the success of the main effort. In this case, Prigozhin, of course, never ever considered himself to be under the Ministry of Defense. He didn't take orders from Gerasimov, and it was a bit disingenuous when he blamed them for not giving him enough ammunition, when they would have said, well, you don't work for us anyway. Why are we? And so that kind of incoherence and chaos inside the Russian command structures, not only would that trickle down to the generals and colonels below them, which would ensure no cohesion in the effort, it just completely eroded the trust that is an essential element of combat. To be successful, you have to believe that people on your left and right and behind you are going to do everything they can to protect you, and vice versa. So that entire essential element of warfighting is not there. It's absolutely not there. And then, of course, you can imagine the logistics. If you're in a system that is so corrupt that people are stealing and paying off to get stuff, this would just really make it that much more difficult for the units that are sitting in these trenches there in Ukraine.
Yeah. So then on to the question that I had asked before of what do you make of sort of how quickly this whole thing dissipated? It seems like it was a flash in the pan in a way. It was suddenly there and then suddenly over. How do you explain that?
That was the biggest surprise for me. And I have to confess to being disappointed. I mean, I wanted to see how this was going to play out. Now, these are people's lives at stake, so this is not a game. But from an abstract sort of sense, watching what was taking place in front of the whole world, it was fascinating. I mean, I saw all kind of people were using Google Maps, tracking the progress and looking at, where they were. It was almost like watching O.J. Simpson and the White Bronco. We were all trying to figure it out. And then when they say, no, he stopped and he's turned around, like, what? Because there was nothing about what the government was doing that would have said, obviously, okay, they're about to get crushed. In fact, the only thing that the Russian Ministry of Defense could muster were some aircraft that were shot down by Wagner. So that undermines some of the theories out there that this whole thing was staged, because there was actual people were getting killed, and very expensive and important aircraft were lost, including the one particular airborne command and control platform. I have to say, though, and I'm glad that you characterized this the way you did, that this was an attempted mutiny. Some people have called it a rebellion. Some people have called it a coup. It's neither of those. A coup seeks to overthrow the government. A mutiny is something that is done traditionally because soldiers or sailors are unhappy with their conditions. It's the lethal military equivalent of going on strike, basically. Mm-hmm. And I think Prigozhin really was extremely unhappy that his business was about to be absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. That was an order that had come out, and there was no way he was going to subsume himself or his very, very prosperous business to Shoigu, who's just as corrupt but sits in a legitimate position. And I think that he also probably had in mind some gigantic payoff. That's probably what this was all about, not the chance to go live in Belarus the rest of his life. I doubt that's very appealing. So we don't know how this is really going to turn out. People are speculating. Did Lukashenko really, is he the hero here? Is he the savior of the situation, which is also ironic. I can't believe that the Wagner's just going to, okay, out of business, we're done. Too much money they were making for a lot of people.
So I want to pick up on some of what you just said in just a moment. But first, this incident where a couple of aircraft were shot down, in some of the assessments that I was reading, there was a real concern that this could spark a civil war in Russia as well, and that it could escalate further, which I think it contributes to sort of the surprise that it dissipated as quickly as it did. Were you concerned that this could spark a civil war in Russia?
I did believe it was possible, but that was based on a very hasty assumption on my part, which has turned out apparently to be wrong. That that Prigozhin had been working on this thing for a couple of months. I mean, the way he took over the headquarters in Rostov, we're talking about Southern Military District. That's the equivalent of somebody taking over U.S. European Command or Central Command. I mean, a major headquarters and major logistics site, and they took it over without a fight. So I thought, okay, well, this is obviously inside job. They've agreed to do it. So that gave me some, caused me to believe that he had done the necessary groundwork so that people on the inside, on the Russian side, were going to support, and that they were waiting for the signal or the spark. And then the fact that he really had nobody, not only land forces available or out there to stop him or his column, but also you didn't see a lot of people, senior officials. I mean, where was Lavrov? Where was Patriarch Kirill? None of the other generals were out there, and especially there were no people in the street saying, no, this can't happen. It was like everybody was, I don't know how many memes I saw of people eating popcorn. It was, everybody wanted to watch. So I did think, though, that he had inside help and that they were going to kind of come out and support him. And if that would have been the case, I mean, you could have had a serious civil war breaking out if there were people that were actually willing to fight for Putin against Prigozhin. Now, the number of vehicles, I don't know if we'll ever know, that were in this column. I've heard the number 400, whether it was 200 or 500, that's not enough to overthrow the government. I mean, in a metro area like Moscow, 400 vehicles will disappear miles before they ever get to the city center.
Right.
So that's why I never thought this was a serious attempt to overthrow the government. This was a demonstration, which is what he ended up doing.
So you obviously just mentioned that senior officials were sort of conspicuous through their absence. People like Lavrov, but even President Putin. I mean, he went quiet for all of Sunday and until yesterday evening. We didn't hear anything from Prigozhin. We didn't really hear much from Lukashenko either. And then yesterday evening, Putin delivered a very brief televised address where, of course, he condemned the Wagner Group and said that the mercenaries needed to either swear their allegiance to Russia or leave for Belarus. And it was interesting then also to hear sort of some of the Western responses, if you will. Josep Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, told journalists that, quote, Russia's political system is showing fragilities and the military power is cracking. I guess, one question I'd have for you is how much do you think Putin has been weakened by this incident?
Well, he certainly falls well below the standard he set for himself over the last 20 years with this cultivation of a image, the bare-chested fisherman riding horses, doing judo and that all that nonsense. That's gone forever. I mean, it really is, in a way, the great Oz. It's a sick, scared little man behind the curtain. Of course, the problem is that he has thousands of nuclear weapons. One of the most interesting takeaways for me from this is that this fear that we hear about so much, that many reasonable, smart, very high-ranking people have, that got to be careful. We can't humiliate him. Can't put him in a corner that he'll have to use a nuclear weapon. He was put in a very, very tight corner. The whole world watched. And what did he do? He negotiated through Lukashenko with Prigozhin. I mean, that doesn't exactly sound like the guy that's, this incredible Russian strongman. I mean, Stalin would have probably killed 15, 20,000 people within the hour just to make sure he got them all. So I think he's done in terms of having this sort of power, but also, James Scherr is a guy who I think a lot of, one of the best Russia experts that's out there, Sherr. He used to be, I think, with Chatham House, and now he's with a think tank in Tallinn. He said, what happened in the last few days is not the kind of thing that occurs in armies that are confident that they are on the path to victory. So I think this also reveals what the morale and the sense of purpose really is inside the Russian military.
So you've talked a little bit about Lukashenko, but who do you think is the winner out of this? I mean, it seems obvious that Putin is weakened coming out of this. I think that Prigozhin is weakened coming out of this, right? He's no longer able to act as freely as he was able to. Is there a winner?
Well, on that side, probably Lukashenko, in that he just got, if this is all true, and I'm still waiting to get some more confirmation of how many Wagner fighters actually there are, where do they end up, what do they do, Prigozhin, what are the sort of the terms of reference for his taking up temporary residence in Minsk, which is hard to believe. If that's all true, then Lukashenko just bought himself a serious set of security. I mean, a gigantic personality, almost unlimited resources, and several thousand experienced criminal mercenaries. So that will protect him from his own internal problems, because his army is terrible. They're bad, but his interior security services pretty strong. But this could add to that, makes it a little bit more unlikely that Russia attempts to sort of take over Belarus, or more difficult. I don't see this as doing anything, creating more of a threat on Ukraine's northern border. Lukashenko, he knows that his guys would get smashed as soon as they cross into Ukraine, and I think he's probably more worried that they would actually refuse the order. People in Belarus do not have the same animosity towards Ukraine that the Kremlin does. And of course, Lukashenko now maybe sees a business partner too. He'd like to get involved with some of the diamond mines down in Africa that Wagner has. Yeah. On the other side, I think the Ukrainians benefit from this potentially enormously. I mean, Zelensky looks like, the greatest wartime leader since Churchill, compared to his Russian opponent, and Ukrainian people. I think the military understands that this represents more opportunity for them. And I like the way that Zelensky and Reznikov, the defense minister, have reached out publicly to all the Russian soldiers saying, you do not have to die here. Your enemy is in Moscow. Your enemy is not here. And, they're just reminding everybody what Prigozhin exposed. The reasons for being there, false. The number of casualties versus what's being reported, all of that. I think that's the right approach.
So I'd like to come back to the Ukrainian response and what this means for the counteroffensive in just a minute. But there are a couple viewer questions that hone in on Russia and are related to what's going on in Russia. We talked a little bit about sort of what the response in Russia was like, and one of our viewers is interested in how you would describe the Russian public's response to the mutiny. The viewer goes on to say that as news of the mutiny reached Moscow, flights departing from the city sold out. So what does that say about the Russian public?
It says that all these scenes that Putin put together of people waving flags in the stadium, and you see crowds of Russian supporters at tennis matches down in Australia or whatever, showing that, yes, but they are some of the biggest, most spineless people without real heart and soul and character. All this nonsense that, Ukraine is Holy Land and Crimea is Holy Land for Russia, absolute BS. The last September, you remember when Shoigu declared a partial mobilization, 500,000 military-age male Russians left the country rather than be mobilized. 500,000. And their country's at war. And I thought, Ukraine is Holy Land, and the patriarch said, we got to go, this is ours. This is BS. And then you remember the video from last summer, Russians on a holiday there on the Black Sea coast in Crimea, and a drone hits the Saki air base there, and it was like a bunch of prairie dogs stood up and looked over like, what was that? And then the next day, you've got the world's biggest shtal as they're all trying to get out of Crimea. So what you just described, all the flights getting out of there, is a continuation of this. They don't care. I mean, they actually don't care. The elites, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, who have become rich because of oil and gas and Putin, their kids are not in this fight. Not at all. And I think what we saw happening on the streets was either opportunistic or they were totally apathetic. What's more stark is that nobody came out into the streets to protect Putin the way during the attempted coup in Turkey 6 years ago. I think it was 6 years ago, where all kinds of people came out in the street to stop the coup. What a difference.
At an event an in-person event that we hosted in New York yesterday, the question came up of what might come after Putin, and the response was kind of, be careful what you wish for. And one of our viewers today submitted the question, sort of looking to the future, looking forward, do you think that regime change in Moscow would be in the West's interest? And either way, how should the West react to the current situation?
So this is, I think, probably the biggest question that's out there right now. I mean, what happens? I certainly see a lot of really good, smart people thinking about it. I believe we have been mistaken for a very long time, thinking that somehow we could dial it up and down, that we could sort of, if we're really careful, if we're really smart diplomats, we can do this without upsetting Putin, without causing escalation. And in fact, because of this, really, I would say, lack of clarity of what we're trying to do. I mean, without being able to say our strategic objective is this, it's got to be something more than avoid nuclear war. That's a worthy ambition, but if that's the goal, then let's just go ahead and surrender. So, what is it we really want to accomplish? But because we never, under any administration for the last 25 years, could do that, we failed to act after Russia invaded Georgia. We failed to act after they jumped over the red line in Syria. We failed to act in a decisive way after they invaded Crimea. And so here we are. So what's been missing is a clear outline of our strategy, really standing up for the values we say that matter, and holding Russia accountable. Russia has never been a state. It's been an empire, one form or another, for over 5 centuries. It's never been a state. The Russian people have never had to reckon with what their government's leaders do or have done. And so until they are crushed, until they are defeated on the battlefield, and that this czarist type of government is finally stopped, then we're going to get more Putins. Now, I cannot imagine someone being any worse than him. Whoever comes next is going to inherit a much weaker situation because the military has been shattered, defense industry has been shattered. Not one person in the world believes a single thing that comes out of the mouth of any official that we see in Moscow. Even the most hardcore Putin-versters in Berlin are having to kind of say like, oh, I guess, maybe I was wrong. So I'm sorry for going on too long on this. I'm not an advocate for regime change, causing regime change. We've tried that ourselves 3 or 4 times, and it never turns out the way you want it. But I think we should not make the mistake of going to extreme steps to prevent it from happening if that's what Russian people want to do. We just have to know, okay, who's got hold of all the nukes? I mean, that will be number one. The Chinese absolutely do not want regime to collapse because they're worried about access to cheap gas.
Yeah. So let's pivot a little bit to Ukraine and to the counteroffensive. You said a little earlier that Ukraine possibly benefits from this situation, from the failed mutiny. One of our viewers is curious whether the fall of the Wagner Group actually might help Russian efforts in Ukraine or not. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what impact the mutiny could have on Kyiv's counteroffensive.
So I had not considered the question there, that does the loss of Wagner somehow help the Russian effort? I suppose there could be a way. I'm not seeing it. The problems that the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian military have are so pervasive and so into the fabric of this rotten, corrupt institution that it's going to take more than getting a new Minister of Defense or a new Chief of the General Staff or getting rid of an ulcer like Wagner to fix it. I mean, it really is. I was reading a long analysis earlier today of the corruption, of how it permeates everything. There's zero trust in any of the leaders. Everybody knows you're out for themselves. And so the things that kind of make soldiers do unbelievable stuff is usually the cohesion they feel inside their unit, the confidence that the higher headquarters is going to do everything in its power to get them what they need, and the fact that you're fighting for something. None of those conditions exist anywhere in the Russian military right now. And it's not likely to get better anytime soon. That doesn't mean there's not brave Russian soldiers or that they're not tough or that they can't kill. But the things necessary for them to be as good as we thought they were, I don't believe they exist. I mean, the Black Sea Fleet, terrified of coming anywhere close to the Ukrainian coast, and Ukraine didn't even have a navy. Russian Air Force, they don't fly over Ukraine. They stay way away and launch missiles against apartment buildings. So a year and a half, the Russians have not been able to destroy one single train or convoy bringing equipment from Poland into Ukraine. What? I mean, that's job one. David stuff. Cut the line of communication of your enemy, and they're not able to do it. So I think that the loss of Wagner, that will be a capability that the Russians are going to miss. I mean, if it's 10, 15, 20,000 troops experienced with weapons, they're either going to walk away or they're going to be redistributed. That'll be hard to replace. The last thing I'd say on this, or before I shut up, is if I'm a Russian soldier, or maybe I'm a junior officer, and I'm sitting in my bunker here, and I know that the counteroffensive has started, and I'm getting hit with artillery, and there's fighting in different places, but all I can see is what's happening here, and I'm beginning to wonder what the heck is going on above me and behind me. Are people? Because soldiers will know what's going on. I mean, they have ways of learning. So the fact that this mutiny occurred will be well known to all of them. And they got to be thinking, well, this whole thing might be over. I mean, it might be getting ready to collapse. I do not want to be killed in the last weeks of a losing effort, or I do not want to be terribly wounded when this thing is about to end anyway. And so I think their enthusiasm for the really, really hard fighting is going to wane.
So maybe related to that, one of our viewers just submitted a question asking how long Russia can maintain current operations in Ukraine without economic consequences that Russian people will notice.
Yeah. This is a really good question because the value and importance of sanctions is hard, are not always immediately apparent. I'm a believer in sanctions because we know it has affected Russia's defense industry. It prevents people from providing things to them because they don't want to get sanctioned. I think that's part of the reason China has not done more. The Russians are not able to replenish all of their lost or expended precision weapons, so they're having to make do with ersatz components. So the sanctions have an effect, but I don't know that the average Russian outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg really feels it yet. I mean, I think there's a worse wealth poverty gap in Russia than there is in the US or any other country. I mean, and so the people in Moscow, the elites, are, the only pain they're going to feel is that they can no longer own an apartment in Mayfair in London, or go down to what's the place, go skiing in Kitzbühel, and do that kind of stuff in Germany or Austria. So that's too long, but I think the only way the Russian population feels it is if they begin to feel unsafe, or they lose another son, a brother, a husband, or that sort of thing.
So picking up on that, I mean, I thought it was interesting, following the press reports about the EU ministers, foreign ministers meeting yesterday. It seemed as if they were really at pains, in a sense, to stress that the Wagner mutiny was an internal matter for Russia, and not sort of a broader issue. And yet there seems to be a real sense of growing urgency around the situation, given the instability that's now possible within Russia. And I think that picks up on sort of the previous viewer's question of really some concern about what might happen to Russia or in Russia in the coming days and weeks. Is that something that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I did an op-ed for the Telegraph I think it was early last summer, about a year ago, where I said I think we might be looking at early stages of the Russian Federation coming apart. And I don't advocate for it, but we can't just assume it won't happen and not be prepared. And so what are we doing to make sure that nuclear weapons don't get shipped off to Iran by somebody, sold to Iran? Because there will be plenty of people that will want to do that. I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine that we have agencies, and as does the UK and Germany and others, that kind of have a sense of where most of these things are located. So that would be an important part of this. There's a lot of people that depend on Russian gas still. So the energy infrastructure, who will control that? But I think if it starts not because of something we're doing, and I don't think that we can necessarily stop it. But there will be people that are in the shadows a little bit. That's not the right way to describe it. You've got the very well-known visible faces that are around Putin, but there's this other second and third ring of people, the oligarchs, that basically help keep him in power. And they're the ones that will lose billions of dollars, as well as potentially their life. And so I think there will be people that have various security capabilities that would be prepared to step in. So I don't expect it to be an apocalyptic collapse.
Mhm. But
To be honest, I hope it happens.
but in terms of sort of outside perspectives, we have a question from somebody who's curious about how China might view Russia, and my words, whether Beijing sort of smells blood in the water. The viewer is curious whether China will view Russia as being finished and start making moves, perhaps about readjusting their frontier with Russia, perhaps other ways of one-upmanship, of trying to really take advantage of Russia's weakness.
So there never was, in my view, this friends without limits relationship. That was a label that they gave it, but clearly there are limits, and that Russia is the junior partner in this thing. And I have to imagine that right now President Xi and his team are thinking, man, I'm handcuffed to a corpse here. So I do believe that the Chinese are not interested in a collapse, mainly because I think they prize stability, and they prize guaranteed access to markets and to energy, and they don't want to see anything happen that could be translated into action by Taiwan, for example, or anything like that. So status quo, I think, is the priority for the Chinese. Having said that, they also will see opportunity, and through either by doing it by force, which is unlikely, or some sort of arrangements, they could get back what they think was taken from them by the czars, a few hundred years ago. So I think they'll also obviously be worried about nuclear weapons on their border, in the hands of bad people. But I can't guess which way they go.
Yeah, so related, I mean, we'll have to watch and see how that develops, but related to how things might unfold, one of our viewers is curious to know how concerned you might be that Putin could instigate a terrorist attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The viewer wrote that there were reports last week that this scenario has been planned out and could happen at any moment. If it were to happen, how do you think the West should respond?
So I also believe it is very possible, in part because we know that regime does not care how many innocent people are killed. They demonstrated with the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam that they do not care one drop for damage to the environment. People that live in East Berlin today and in former East Germany know what happens when the Soviet army left, the environmental disaster that was left behind. So I'd say it certainly is possible, but I also believe that because so many countries would be affected by a disaster at Zaporizhzhia, to a greater, it'd be worse than Chernobyl, and a lot of countries would be affected, and so I would expect that very, very strong, clear messages have been sent to the Kremlin saying, absolutely not. The price you will pay will be catastrophic, as if you had used a nuclear weapon in a traditional sense. So I think that, of course, it's possible. I just think it's very unlikely.
So coming back to the counteroffensive, right, which is the topic that we wanted to talk about several weeks ago when I reached out to you, it seems as if the U.S. and countries in Europe are urging Kyiv to seize this window of opportunity following the mutiny by the Wagner Group, to really sort of stand by its counteroffensive and to push through against Russian positions. Do you see this as a window of opportunity? Do you think that Russian forces are significantly weakened so that this does create an opportunity for the Ukrainian forces?
I think that of course, what's happened recently will affect the Russian side, but the Ukrainians are on their counteroffensive. Got underway 3 weeks ago-ish, but I don't think we've seen the main attack yet. And so they'll go on their own pace as they're ready. When you're attacking well-prepared defenses with minefields and artillery and all these things, it's very hard. I've watched two different videos earlier today of Ukrainian troops in the trenches fighting. I mean, this is your teeth are clenched. I mean, this is just hard watching what they're doing. So I think they probably are learning a lot. They're getting important experiences and they're adapting. I've never met soldiers that adapt as fast as Ukrainian soldiers. Not American, German, British, nobody. And so I anticipate that here in the coming days, next week, 2 weeks, whatever, they will have created a breakthrough in one or two places. And when they do, then you're going to see them pushing 2 or 3 armored brigades. I mean, you're talking about 500-700 armored vehicles through one of these cracks, if you will. I don't know where it's going to be, but this is what I anticipate will happen. What would really be nice is if the United States would get serious about Ukraine winning. Now, the administration, which deserves huge credit for what it has done, of keeping 50 nations together. We have provided an enormous amount of stuff and financial support. But what we haven't gotten from the administration is a clear definition of desired strategic outcome. They haven't said, we want Ukraine to win. Crimea, yes, Crimea is Ukrainian sovereign territory. Yes, Crimea has to be liberated. And therefore, we're going to give you what you need, which is F-16s, ATACMS, the long-range capabilities that are needed. Until then, you're going to see really, really hard-fighting, brave Ukrainian land forces fighting without the benefit of everything that we would have, air power, long-range precision weapons.
So related to that, one of our viewers says that isn't there supposed to be a 3-to-1 advantage for an attack to have prospects of success? And if that's the case, is Ukraine anywhere close to that, especially given Russian minefields and Russian forces on the ground?
So this is an excellent point. Yes, the 3-to-1 is kind of the traditional military theory about if you're in the attack, you need a predominance of force based on, number one, you're going to have to achieve overwhelming firepower against somebody that's fighting from a dug-in position, and you're going to have casualties because of that. So you need a larger force. But this force ratio, where it matters, is at the point. It's not an overall, well, the Ukrainians do not have 3 times more troops than the Russians in general. It's at the point of the fight. And so I think they will be able to do that once they have created they've discovered vulnerabilities or created initial penetrations. And then you're going to see 10-to-1 as they start pushing through armored vehicles that start rolling over trenches. They've just got to get through these the minefields. That's the big challenge.
Ben, as we sort of start to wrap up, I want to circle back to Germany. Of course, you're based in Germany and following what's going on in Germany very, very closely. And in the last few days, there have been a couple of interesting developments when it comes to German military activity. One example is that just this week, it was announced that 4,000 German troops would be deployed to Lithuania. This is something that was discussed last year in a memorandum between Olaf Scholz and the Lithuanian president, but it seems to actually be happening now. Just last week, Air Defender 2023 was completed. This was billed as the biggest air deployment exercise in NATO's history, and I understand it was a German idea that led to that. It was hosted by Germany, involved some 250 aircraft from 25 countries. The US was a big supporter and was heavily involved in that. Are we seeing a more muscular posture when it comes to defense in Germany?
So I think what we're seeing is a very, very good defense minister who is, and so somebody said that it's amazing what happens when you have a defense minister in Germany who not only is skilled and intelligent, but also seems to like the job. And so, that's an important thing. And so I think Minister Pistorius deserves credit for much of what you just talked about. Now, of course, he's not an independent agent. He can't do that by himself. And the air defender exercise would have been conceived before he became the defense minister.
Right. And even before, I mean, my understanding, it was conceived even before this chapter in the war in Ukraine erupted, right? So it was conceived before February of last year.
An exercise like Air Defender with 250 aircraft from several different nations, this is not something you pull out of a hat. So I listened to Lieutenant General Leutnant Gerhardt, the General Inspector of the Luftwaffe, in Berlin last week. He spoke at our Atlanta Brücke event. I was impressed. I mean, that guy, he's a serious warfighter. He's got some charisma. He's not bashful about being what he is, which is a warrior for his country and for the alliance. And next to him was a U.S. Air Force 3-star, the head of the Air National Guard for the United States, who was responsible for getting almost 100 aircraft to participate. This was a German-led, German-organized air defender exercise that not only had a bunch of aircraft, but you can imagine the amount of ground support required for 250 aircraft. I mean, if you sit on the Lufthansa flight on the tarmac there here at Frankfurt Airport, and you look out the window, you see all the stuff that's required, right? Mm-hmm. Only that's what you got to have for that many aircraft as well: fuel, ammunition, maintenance, you name it. So that was impressive, and they addressed one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have in NATO is our ability to protect our civilian population, air and missile defense. And so this was an important development, and they weren't bashful about it. And what was interesting that 2/3, there was a poll that was in Der Spiegel that it came out. It said 2/3 of Germans were fine with the fact that their flights may have been disrupted. There would have been some interruptions because of what it was about. Of course, the headline from Der Spiegel was 1/3 of Germans are unhappy about it. But the fact is 2/3 of Germans, which is a remarkable number, were okay with this. And then the other announcement that just came out the other day was Mr. Pistorius announcing that Germany was going to provide a permanent brigade to Lithuania. That's remarkable. A promise had been made in Madrid at the NATO summit that Germany would provide a rotational brigade of some sort. Yeah. And in fact, only one battalion was there with the brigade headquarters. I think that's actually what was promised, and the Lithuanians said expected more. Now, a permanent brigade. I mean, living just like you have an American unit that lives in Vilsack here, or Ansbach or Kaiserslautern. A German brigade living. I'm impressed. And the key, of course, Lithuania will have to do their part to make sure that there are places for this unit to train, like we have at Grafenwehr and Hohenfels. Otherwise, that German unit will lose readiness. I'm impressed, and right in time, ahead of the Vilnius summit. And I think Germany also, it feels like, is increasingly willing to openly call for Ukrainian membership in NATO as well.
So the symbolism of this is incredibly important, but do you think it's also more than that? Do you think that really can be a front line of defense?
It's essential. Look, there has been little to no public criticism about either of these things I've talked about. I mean, of course, you'll have a handful of people that will have something to say about it, but the ones that would have cried about it the most, they're busy defending their own capital from a mutiny. So I think that the German leadership rediscovering self-confidence that
Mhm.
to do all the right things to defend your population does not make you a warmonger, does not make you a threat. It's the opposite.
Mhm.
And so I think not only is this important symbolism, it's important leadership that a lot of countries have been able to hide behind Germany for not doing more defense investment. Now, this is still an issue. The German defense investment is, actually not going to be where it's supposed to be. So they'll have to address that, and that will take the Bundestag will need to, hold the government feet to the fire on this. But I'm encouraged.
Well, so let me pick up on that question about defense investment, because I wanted to go there as well. Obviously, in Chancellor Scholz's Zeitenwende speech, he also announced 100 billion euro special fund to revitalize the Bundeswehr. My understanding is that very little of that money has been spent. I learned yesterday that much of it has been allocated, and that we should see sort of the spending of that unfolding in the coming months. But it's still not enough to really bring the Bundeswehr to where it needs to be. What's your take on that special fund, but also on some of the procurement questions around having the systems that the Bundeswehr actually needs to be to get to where it needs to be?
So Germany is, in fact, modernizing in terms of aircraft. Everybody in the Luftwaffe wanted the F-35, and so they made the decision to do that. New helicopters, those kinds of things. But in my view, it's not about procurement that is the most important thing that Germany needs to do. It needs to be a focus on Einsatzbereitschaft, the readiness. I mean, that's the reason you have a military, is to be ready to do what it takes. And modernization is only a piece of that. It's having the right number of people to fill out your units, aircraft, ships, vehicles, etc. Women and men who are trained to do their job. That's the most important part of readiness, is having the people as well as the stuff. And you have to train, you have to exercise. And so what I hope is that there will be a growing demand in the Bundestag from the government on the Bundeswehr, and specifically on the defense ministry. Hey, we're paying a lot of money. We need to see that you guys are ready to do the job. Here's what we need you ready to do. And it will help that NATO at this Vilnius summit will formally approve several plans, regional plans, in which the German Bundeswehr has a critical role to play. That gives you the demand signal. That's the demand signal that Minister Pistorius and General Breuer need when they turn to the Bundestag and say, hey, we have to be able to do these things. You agreed as part of the alliance. Here's our role. And I think this demand signal will go a long way towards raising the level of Einsatzbereitschaft in the Bundeswehr that I remember when I was a lieutenant in the 80s, when the German army was the envy of everybody in Europe.
Yeah. So Ben, let me ask you one final question as we wrap up and sort of go back to where we started, which is to talk a little bit about the Wagner Group. And I'd like to close with a question that came from one of our viewers who's curious to know what your best guess is with what happens with the Wagner Group in the Middle East and in Africa, where they've also been very active. What's more likely, that we'll see Prigozhin continue in a leadership role, that we'll see another leader emerge of the Wagner Group, or that the group basically dissipates?
So, the market for what they provide in places like Africa and the Middle East will never go away. I mean, that market's going to be there. So I would say the potential for somebody else stepping up to fill it, if Wagner or Prigozhin literally goes out of business, so there will still be opportunity, unless we, the West, think strategically and invest and do things so before the Chinese get in there or mercenaries like Wagner. Now, I see opportunity if the leadership of Wagner is killed or locked away or in exile or whatever. If they're not able to do what they were doing, this could be a chance to eliminate or counter their efforts in these different countries where they are extracting enormous wealth, and only the very, very top elites in those countries are benefiting from what Wagner is providing. We had a case I was reading about the other day. I was reminded it happened during the time when Secretary Mattis was our Secretary of Defense, and he was asked, "Hey, didn't you Americans, didn't you kill some Wagner? I mean, wasn't there some combat in Syria?" And sure enough, it was a Wagner group that challenged an American unit that was in Syria, part of the counter-ISIS effort, and several hundreds of them were killed. Wagner were killed in this engagement. No Americans were lost. And so somebody asked Secretary Mattis, "Is that well? What happened after that?" He said, "Yeah, they never bothered us again." So this is how I think this is how you deal with thugs and bullies and autocrats. Is you absolutely have to be firm and hard and show that you're not going to give in to that.
Well, Ben, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. It is always a treat to talk with you, and you are incredibly insightful. Have your finger on the pulse of what's going on, and I am sure that we will have you back again. But thank you for helping us understand what just happened over the weekend and what's going on the ground, and for your assessment of the situation. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the privilege, Steve.
And of course, thanks to all of our viewers for some great questions. I think that they really helped guide the conversation. We look forward to having more discussions on these important issues with people like Ben Hodges. And once again, Ben, huge thanks to you for taking the time to talk with us.